Some of you will know this, I'm guessing not all of you, but I was this morning at the funeral of Professor Marion Sims, who was a great Australian political scientist and among many, many other things, and whose legacy is just huge for all of us, both political scientists, not political scientists, women in all parts of academia. And one of the things that we were asked to do at the ceremony today was to take one of Marion's scarves. Marion was a great scarf wearer. And so I have taken a scarf for the Australian Political Studies Association that we will be using as part of our own commemoration of Marion's life. But I just thought, given what we were all here today to talk about and engage with, that would be an appropriate thing to begin with. But anyway, back to business. We have a pretty serious lineup of people to get through in this session, some of whom are online, some of whom are here. And oh yes, I can see Sarah on the screen over there. Looks like the sun might be shining over there, Sarah. Possibly.
Yes, it is. Sorry, I had my mute on, but yes, good morning from London.
It's always good to check these things. Okay, so this is the last session of the day, and you all know the form by now. Each presenter gets to speak. In this case, for 8 minutes, we will take all of the presentations one after another before we throw open for questions, both from the floor, but also from people who are online. My happy task is to introduce each of the speakers in the interests of time, and in order that we might get to the discussion as quickly as we can. You'll forgive me if I don't read out the bios. They're in the documentation. You know who many of these people are, and their bios give you a very good indication and description of both why they're here and what they'll be contributing. I've been asked to remind you to contribute to Padlet for the brainstorming platform ahead of the submission of the document, and also I've been asked to basically just keep encouraging you to contribute and ask questions. So I will aim to do all of those things in the session. So the panel is on new international approaches to Parliament as a workplace. And we have a stellar lineup of people from all over the world who will be giving us different perspectives on this before we break into discussion. So first up, we have Sarah Childs, who is online, and Sonia Palmieri, who is with us, thankfully. And it's a joint presentation. This will be fascinating. Sonia is going to be presenting in person and be managing the slides, and Sarah is going to speak live via Zoom once we hope that we've got the mute thing sorted out. So without further ado, Sonia, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Helen. It's a real pleasure to talk to all of you who remain. Thank you very much. And lovely to see you, Sarah. We've entitled our paper, The New Normal, Realising Gender-Sensitive Parliaments. And when I was writing some notes with Sarah about how to present this, I started with, we're conscious that many people gathered here are familiar with this concept. And yet many of you in the room will have just heard that 4 parliamentarians have never heard of this concept. So for me, I've just been very quickly reflecting on why that might be the case. I am the author of the Gender Sensitive Parliaments report that was published by the IPU in 2011. I wrote it when I was overseas. My partner had a posting to Hanoi, so I wrote it in cafes, and I loved doing that. And that was the time of Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister. When we returned, you'll be familiar with the idea of Julia Gillard becoming the Prime Minister. And in that term, we had the Speaker, Anna Burke. And I actually had the opportunity to talk to Anna Burke about this work, and I worked with her on different things to do with the Pacific. But it was a very short amount of time to convey what was in this quite comprehensive report and program of action. And then we had an election, and we haven't had a return to what I would suggest is a sympathetic ear. In that case, we end up with a situation in which many parliamentarians in Australia are not familiar with key concepts and key terms, which in other parts of the world have become an international global norm. Our reflections today are based on a chapter that we've written for a forthcoming handbook of feminist governance. Thank you, Marion. And our first reflection is that in the last 20 years, almost every major international organisation has made some contribution to the GSP normative framework, what is now this new norm. And so actually we were quite surprised, Sarah and I, maybe I was more surprised than Sarah, but I was quite surprised that it actually goes back to 2001 with a study report of the CPA, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. It then goes to the Gender Sensitive Parliaments report from the IPU. The OECD has written a toolkit for gender sensitising parliaments. The European Institute of Gender Equality has done a major study of gender sensitive parliaments in the European Union. Sarah has just done another fantastic set of guidelines for the CPA. Together, we've written something for UN Women on how we can make parliamentary responses to COVID more gender sensitive. And the OSCE, which is the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, has just done an updated report of gender sensitive parliaments. So this is a 20-year body of work that parliamentarians in Australia don't know anything about. I think what this shows is that it can be used when promoted by the right actors quite effectively. And Sarah here is an example of that. So we can say that the GSP framework can be a form of feminist activism when the tools are used in collaboration between feminist political actors and critical friends and the parliaments themselves. If you're not familiar with Sarah Child's incredibly good work on the Good Parliament, I highly recommend it. But having used some of the work of the IPU, she was able to muscle her way into the House of Commons and propose 43 recommendations. It doesn't stay there. The UK Parliament has itself done a gender sensitive parliament audit in 2018. With the body of work that now exists, Sarah and I have had quite an interesting opportunity to reflect on what it means and how it perhaps could be more importantly and more effectively articulated. When gender sensitive parliaments was originally promoted as an idea, it was said to be something that would remove the barriers for women, principally as members of parliament, to ensure that parliaments were more responsive to women's interests. So there was also a kind of a theme around efficiency and effectiveness. This more modern parliament would have structures, processes, methods of work that would work towards an institutional objective of gender equality. But in the practice over the last 10 years or so, we see that just assuming institutionalization through things like gender mainstreaming, gender budgeting, having a women's caucus is not enough. And so we've articulated a new definition of gender sensitive parliaments, which I think is more active in voice. It is written as a continuing action. It's placing emphasis on the value and the priorities of gender equality, so that the parliament understands gender equality as a social, economic and political objective. And it's not just accepting that, but it's reorientating all of its work. It's transforming the parliament to achieve that objective. This, of course, requires collaboration across a variety of actors. And I think, Sarah, that's where I stop and you keep going.
Wonderful. What I can't see, Sonia, is the slides, which isn't a problem, but I will just presume that we now have our 4 dimensions of a gender-sensitive parliament slide up. Wonderful, thank you. Sonia always pushes me to do things outside my comfort zone, and perhaps co-presenting thousands and thousands of miles away is one of them. Anyway, so as I said before, good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this event. Working with Sonia has, of course, been much fun, as well as intellectually, I hope, really pushing at how we understand, conceive of, and perhaps then can practice gender-sensitive parliaments. So as Sonia mentioned, my work in the Good Parliament report does draw very heavily on the IPU's approach to gender sensitivity, but they worked with a larger number of dimensions. And in the Good Parliament report, I was kindly persuaded by clerks and former clerks of the House that members of Parliament often might find it difficult to negotiate with a large number of dimensions. And I actually worked just with 3, the first 3 on this slide, but I think it's absolutely fundamental that we predominantly work with the 4. And the reason for that, and I won't be going through all of these dimensions with you today, but just to introduce them very briefly. But what really matters is that we treat the institution as a holistic, organic institution, and that we look at who's present and how they are present, how effective and what positions they take, the kind of infrastructure, how the parliament is organised, its culture, but also what it achieves, the extent to which it delivers what we might call the good representation of women and gender equality. So those are the 4 dimensions that we feel really enable particularly actors within the institution to break down what I think can feel like such an enormous task, which is to make our parliaments gender sensitive institutions. And in fact, just to, again to update Sonia's point about the UK Parliament, yesterday the Women and Equalities Committee of the UK Parliament was holding evidence sessions from the Leader of the House, the Shadow Leader of the House. My screen has just gone black, which makes me slightly concerned, but I'm going to carry on anyway.
We can see you.
Taking evidence on updates since the 2018 IPU gender sensitive audit. If we could move to the next slide, please.
Yep.
So once again, I can't take you through all of the stages of parliaments, and particularly the House of Commons response to gender sensitive parliaments, because once again, whilst my report was very much focused on the House of Commons, the IPU audit was actually of both the Commons and the Lords. Nor can I take you through all of the bullying and sexual harassment reforms and responses in the last couple of years. So what I want to do is to make a number of points about how both played out and the way in which they interacted or were sequential and had effects. So the first really significant point is that they were largely separate processes. That, as Sonia suggested, as my work on gender sensitising the British House of Commons was about me inviting myself in, managing to be allowed in, trying to act as what I'm calling a putative feminist academic critical actor. So I had sufficient insider status, if you like, to get that self-invitation accepted and be able to work with a modernising speaker and with established contacts across the House, particularly in terms of women MPs, but also on the administrative side. And here I would stress those relationships are very, very critical too, to the content of what I could actually do, the quality of the work I could actually achieve. Now, questions around harassment and bullying were predominantly outside of my terms of remit. And of course, they were the terms that I gave myself. And that's because I did not look at the administrative side of the institution. I was in Parliament originally, supposedly only for 3 months. I did not have the skills, I felt, to engage with human resources, employment law. And that meant that whilst my first recommendation was about the introduction of a behaviour code, and whilst I was aware of some of the allegations, members of staff would periodically talk to me about some of the behaviour they witnessed and or had experienced. Because of the limitations in my remit and my own expertise, as I said, that meant that I offered, if you like, a tokenistic, but nonetheless, I think, symbolic recommendation. But for me, it really illuminates the importance that the IPU place on looking at an institution overall. So you can't just separate it out. But I think it also illuminates some of the ways in which we need to think about institutional governance in many ways, as well as structures and architecture. The second point I'd make is about timing and sequencing, as I suggested. Now, the public airing, public discussions around sexual harassment and gendered bullying really entered the public consciousness after my secondment to the House of Commons. But it has had an indirect, and I think some direct effects on the wider capacity of the gender sensitive Parliament work. And in part that relates very much to the way it had an effect on the new group of MPs that was established in 2016 by the then Speaker to take forward the Good Parliament report, to take forward, if you like, a gender sensitive Parliament's agenda for the House of Commons. And so in a context of bullying and harassment claims and criticisms of both the Speaker and the higher echelons of the administrative side of the House, that new grouping of MPs ceased to meet. And that was quite a problematic moment. It also overlapped with, and I would suggest was informed by, wider debates on Brexit politics, which also, I think, really illustrates the extent to which our work as gender sensitive Parliament's practitioners is very much in the hands of the wider politics and divisions that characterise and tensions that characterise our political institutions. So this leads me to my third point, which is about those tensions that affect the wider success or failure or limitations of gender sensitising Parliament's efforts. And often that can be about tensions between the political and the administrative side, and so that you need to have sufficient information. Your political antennae need to be attuned to those. I think it's also the case of recognising the extent to which the higher grades of the administrative service may well, in many ways, be at some distance from others in that organisation and be part of reproducing gendered hierarchies, deference and service cultures, which I think can be hugely problematic. For example, when I was called in by a senior government minister to explain my presence in Parliament, although obviously I'd had all of the formal approval that was necessary, I was warned it was going to be hostile. And at the time, I thought this was concern from a senior clerk for my well-being, and in lots of ways it was, but it also now, with hindsight, really illustrates to me the fact that we often warn the women or we move the women out of the way of inappropriate behaviour rather than sanctioning that inappropriate behaviour. It also reminds me recently when there was a debate on a vote on an amendment to stop the new process being fully independent, sitting with senior or middle-ranking female clerks very worried that MPs were going to move away from a commitment to independence. The fourth point is the role of reaction. And I think sometimes of the extent to which when there is a scandal and that has public resonance, institutions, and I guess perhaps MPs in particular, that might be something to discuss, frequently rush to react. And this is really, I think, unhelpful and should be replaced by a more systematic and systemic undertaking of gender-sensitive parliament work. For example, in the British House of Commons, there was a cultural change post, but it was for 1 year. And really, at the moment, we lack in the House of Commons, despite the huge impact that I think, and I'm biased because I wrote the report, that the report has had, is that we currently lack the institutional architecture. And that was one of the points I put to the Women and Equalities inquiry, the current inquiry had a month ago, to say that actually in the absence of a body taking forward an agenda with particular timeframes so that we can be held to account, that the House of Commons currently lacks the kind of institutional architecture that I feel very strongly is necessary to bring about change in a joined up way. So there's lots of work being done. I'm not trying to suggest that the effects of the gender sensitizing process in the House of Commons has stalled, far from it, but it's seemingly lacking political, really senior political leadership, really senior administrative leadership, and in a very joined up fashion. And this points me to my final point, really this fifth observation, which is about conducive conditions. And I've implied this already with the reference to Brexit politics, but actually there was a period, and in the report, the Good Parliament report itself, I talked about 2016, 2018 being a very conducive set of conditions. In a sense, I talked up the centenary of women, some women gaining the right to vote in the United Kingdom. But at that time, there was an ability with those centenary celebrations to create a public demand, if you like, for a better kind of politics, more gender equal politics. I think now, from the perspective of 2021, we have a new speaker, a new government, a conservative government with a large majority, arguments about the extent to which this government has become a populist one. But I think we can see in the context also of COVID politics and the hybrid parliament that actually we are seeing institutional resistance. What we have heard from some of the top members of the current government is an emphasis on the good MP being the MP who is physically present in the chamber. Yesterday, I understand through a colleague that the current leader of the House talked about reforms needing to reflect British society, whereas actually I think very much our political institutions must be leading society and not merely responding to them. So to draw my comments to a close, these UK reflections are somewhat quick and dirty. And I think they beg substantial questions of institutional resistance and how we institutionalize gender sensitizing efforts and actors. I'd want to mention briefly that distinction between gender sensitive parliaments as an aspiration to achieve and the actual active verb of gender sensitizing, of making parliaments feminist. And perhaps to raise the question of whether there is greater stickiness of reforms that are associated with scandal, even if they are produced reactively and quickly, rather than a gender sensitive parliament's definition, which we opened with, and which really challenges the institution to really reorientate its work.
So my focus is on attempts to change workplace culture in the New Zealand Parliament through the institution of a code of conduct. But I want to situate the recent adoption of a code in the context of broader debates on the standards of parliamentary behaviour and what an inclusive House should look like, what a representative House should look like, and more importantly, should act like. So New Zealand has often been at the forefront of diversity and equality in political participation and representation, and this is a really significant point of pride for its MPs. Yet even as this history has been celebrated, even as diversity has further increased over time, traditional norms of parliamentary behaviour have proven to be really sticky, and that's an issue for the effectiveness of a code of conduct. So why was a code of conduct finally introduced last year? As Susan Harris-Rimmer talked about earlier today, it was very much scandal-driven reform. Beginning in 2018, there was a series of public reports alleging bullying by politicians from both the government and opposition sides, particularly of their parliamentary staff. And at the same time, the issue of violence against women MPs was also coming to the fore. In 2018, also, a survey conducted by New Zealand's Commonwealth Women Parliamentarians Group found that women MPs faced widespread sexism, harassment, and violence, particularly psychological violence. So in response to the bullying allegations, a review of the workplace culture of the New Zealand Parliament was commissioned, and the Francis Review was released in May 2019 and found evidence of systemic issues with bullying and harassment within Parliament. The author wrote that a core perceived problem is low accountability, particularly for members who face few sanctions for harmful behaviour. The review's 85 recommendations included the creation of a parliamentary code of conduct, as well as an independent commission for parliamentary conduct. The author argued that a parliamentary workplace code of conduct is a basic requirement, but went on to note that some members view a code of conduct as unnecessarily prescriptive or overly politically correct. But before we get to the code of conduct, I wanted to briefly talk about previous efforts in New Zealand to foster an inclusive parliamentary culture through electoral reform. In the 1990s, New Zealand shifted from a first past the post electoral system to a mixed member proportional or MMP system. Prior to this change, we saw minor parties growing in popularity, but largely being shut out of parliamentary representation. And so calls for electoral reform grew. After winning the 1984 election, the Labour Party set up a Royal Commission on the electoral system, and that they published their report in 1986, which was a bit of a political bombshell. They turned out to be a very activist commission, and they recommended changing the electoral system to MMP, which was something that neither major party wanted to consider really. But there was really effective lobbying from pro-reform groups, which prompted a referendum, and MMP ultimately won out narrowly over FPP. So why MMP? In the electoral reform debates, diversity and representation was a really key concern. And another focus was on the creation of a more collegial political culture, a more collaborative culture, described by some as a less Westminster form of democracy. These two goals were related, as this style of politics was seen as more suitable to and reflective of an increasingly diverse political community. And when MMP was introduced, you did see quite a shift in the formal rules of Parliament to accommodate an increased presence of minor parties and an increased number of women and other previously marginalised groups. An example of this is the sitting calendar was altered to take account of school holidays because so many more women were represented. But fundamentally, hopes of a more collegial and less adversarial style of politics were unmet. It was essentially just politics as usual, but with more women, more minor parties. And while the number of women had increased, experiences of women MPs in the post-MMP era show that sexist norms remain very much entrenched in the New Zealand Parliament. And we saw this in the lead up to the 2020 election. Several retiring women MPs from both the government and the opposition called out instances of sexism that they faced in their parliamentary careers, and they indicated that this was a major reason why they were leaving politics. So during these debates and after the introduction of MMP, these concerns with norms of parliamentary behaviour have led to successive calls for code of conduct. This is not a new debate in New Zealand. Some key kind of moments, in 1995, MP Peter Dunn, who was a Labour Party MP who'd resigned to form his own centrist party. He proposed a voluntary code of conduct. His proposal was rejected, called the equivalent of taking the teetotaler's pledge by the former Prime Minister. But Dunn instead began compiling what he called a bad boys list. So an annual list of Parliament's worst behaved MPs, which he gave to the press, which then gleefully published it. The bad boys list did not always contain men, as it might suggest, but it was very noticeably gendered. No woman ever topped the list, and very few women appeared. While the list generated publicity, it didn't seem to act as a deterrent for named MPs, many of whom appeared regularly and actually seemed kind of proud of it. The limitations of the list were also really clear. There were points allocated for removals from the House, being asked to withdraw and apologise, but there was no ramifications for behaviour outside the chamber, which meant that really obvious incidents of bad behaviour were left out. such as a fist fight that happened between two MPs in the corridor outside the debating chamber in 2007. Coincidentally, that fight involved the current speaker, Trevor Mallard, who's now responsible for implementing the recommendations of the Francis Review. Mallard was also given a Lifetime Achievement Award by Dunn as part of the Bad Boys list in 2009 for services to melodrama, fisticuffs, and generally aberrant behaviour. In 2007, 4 of the 6 minor parties represented in Parliament jointly drafted and signed a voluntary code of conduct. They urged other parties also to sign, but they said that some MPs could sign in secret, essentially, if they didn't want their parties to know that they were signing up to a code of conduct because it was seen as embarrassing. The argument behind this push by the minor parties was that the principles of MMP weren't being respected, that a more cooperative and consultative politics, that was the ambition of the MMP reform, was being set aside for the standard bipartisan struggle, and that the major parties were essentially just steamrolling the minor parties. As in 1995, the code of conduct was not supported by the major parties, and the major concern put forward was with the impact of the proposal on the quality and the robustness of parliamentary debate, that the code of conduct would be a constraint on traditional parliamentary behaviour. For more than 10 years, there was indeed little progress on progressing a code of conduct for the New Zealand Parliament, but this changed in light of the renewed attention on Parliament as a workplace and the media scandal. So in July 2020, Speaker Trevor Mallard released this code of conduct drafted by a cross-party group of MPs. The code's not mandatory. Parties sign up on a voluntary basis, although most have. But crucially, the other recommendation of the Francis Review for an independent commission on parliamentary conduct hasn't been implemented. So we have a code, but without a mechanism for accountability, essentially. So mapping how norms of behaviour have been challenged in the New Zealand Parliament, there are really obvious patterns of resistance, notably from major parties. So given this context and the noted resistance to regulatory intrusions, the introduction of a code of conduct is actually really significant. But the effectiveness of the code of conduct is obviously really limited by its voluntary nature, by the absence of an independent accountability mechanism. A code of conduct is one tool among many in changing political culture, and using it in isolation will hinder its effectiveness. But entrenched resistance to norm change is particularly noticeable in terms of the valorisation of the Westminster principle of robust debate. Despite significant shifts in relation to parliamentary workplace culture in recent years, there continues to be really significant reluctance on the part of MPs to accept any changes that are perceived as affecting the nature of parliamentary debate. So change stops at the door of the House, and it's business as usual from then on. This aspect of parliamentary culture, I think, is a really major barrier to the acceptance and to the effectiveness of codes of conduct and other institutional reforms designed to change standards of behaviour around Parliament, and to efforts towards creating a diverse, representative and inclusive Parliament. And I'll stop there because I'm out of time.
Hello, my name is Josefina Erikson, and this is Cecilia Josefsson. We are both from the Department of Government, Uppsala University, Sweden, and we are very happy to be with you today, even if it had to be this way. So I'm going to share our presentation. Our starting point is that parliaments should be studied as a gendered workplace. A representational perspective has for a long time dominated research on parliaments, while parliamentary working conditions and internal gender equality in comparison have been understudied. We argue that a truly gender equal parliament is one in which all MPs are able to perform their tasks as legislators on equal terms, regardless of their gender, social background, or identity. And That means that we need to study the gendered underpinnings of parliamentary work. We need to focus on formal rules and regulations, but also on informal practices and norms that shape MPs' working conditions. Me Too has demonstrated that there are remaining problems with sexual harassments and gender discrimination also in formally equal parliaments, such as the Swedish one. Formal gender equality is thus no guarantee for equality in working conditions. Working conditions have also implications for representation. So it's important both in its own, but also for the sake of representation. Turning to the Swedish parliament, which is one of the most gender equal parliaments of the world. Sweden has more than 40% women MPs since the 1990s. Women are also well represented on leading positions in the parliament. Women have also made an impact on policy, the content of policy, which has been demonstrated in several studies. And in all, Sweden is often highlighted as a best practice internationally. And looking at the internal working conditions, the Parliament has indeed worked systematically to improve them since the 1990s. And formally, important advancements have been made. First of all, a women's network was established already in 1995, which later changed name to the Parliament's Gender Equality Group. There is also a childcare center free of charge for MPs' children. MPs have the right to parental leave, which is a generous right, and it's the same right that ordinary citizens have. We have also fixed chamber hours and committee hours, which is a way to avoid unpredictable and late night meetings. And for each term, there is a gender equality action plan to ensure a continuous gender equality work. And finally, there is a strong practice to have gender balance in leadership positions. But if we turn to the informal aspects of parliament, what happens? Is the Riksdag gender equal in practice? That is what we have focused on in our research, the informal and qualitative aspects of parliamentary work. Do all legislators have the same possibilities to conduct their parliamentary duties if we look beyond the formal aspects? We have used mixed methods, a survey with all MPs to map out effects and see gendered patterns. And we've also conducted interviews with men and women MPs to better understand and identify the character of gendered norms and practices. Our work has focused around three themes: expectations and demands, power and influence, and the interaction between MPs. And now Cecilia will present our findings.
Okay, so basically then what we find, taking the survey first, we find that men and women MPs have similar experiences of working in the parliament in many respects. For instance, men and women are equally satisfied with the working environment, and they rate their political influence in their respective political parties in equal terms. They rated the best debate space that they see available in equal terms, and they rate their own competence in equal terms. However, there are some remaining problems, especially when it comes to demands and expectations, interactions, and so forth. So, for instance, women experience demands to be higher. Women are more worried about making mistakes, and women are more often subjected to various types of abusive treatment. So, for instance, just to show you some figures, here we ask in the survey, how do you experience the demands placed on you as a member of the parliament? And here we see that gender differences are especially pronounced among young MPs. Young MPs, young women stands out as the group of MPs who perceive demands to be the highest, while young men perceive demands to be the lowest. Again, when we look at the interaction between MPs, we find find a group of young women to be particularly exposed to problematic treatment. Here we just show you some of the results, whether the MPs perceive that they are interrupted in a meeting, whether they experiences their looks to be commented, and whether they experience being subjected to sexist jokes. And again, for each of these three types of problematic treatment, we see that young women are the group most exposed, while young men are the group least exposed. So based on the findings of the survey, there seems to be prevailing masculine practices and norms, which in fact disadvantage women MPs, in spite of these formal gender equal conditions. And therefore, we turn to the interviews to get a better understanding of the informal rules, norms, and practices at play in the parliament, and to what extent these are gendered. To very briefly sum up the findings from the interviews, three important findings stand out, which together demonstrate that masculine coded norms still shape the parliamentary work environment. So first, we find women MPs to have a harder time to be respected as politicians and to be taken seriously. We find competence, that competence is typically associated with masculine traits. Second, we find that men take up more space in the debate and feel more comfortable in the political arena. Women MPs feel less self-evident as space invaders, as others have termed it. And our third important finding here is that women are on a regular basis exposed to negative treatment, such as marginalization, ridicule, objectification, and harassment. And women MPs' competence and presence in politics are questioned to a greater extent than men's. So basically, to conclude, the parliament is a formally gender equal workplace characterized by an ambitious gender equality work, formal significant improvements in terms of gender equality, and in terms of MPs' perceived influence and power, this is also a fairly gender equal parliament. Yet, if we look at the informal aspects, we see that norms of political competences still are at least partly masculine coded. Norms of behavior are also masculine coded, and masculine practices sustain these norms through negative treatment of women MPs. So basically, women MPs' possibilities to conduct their parliamentary duties are to some extent still restricted. So we will end with this, and this is a list of publications coming out of this greater project on gender equality in the Swedish Parliament. And thank you very much for inviting us to this conference. We hope that you will have a good time. Thank you.
Good evening. I am much obliged to Maren and Sonia for inviting me to participate in such an important workshop where we can exchange policy applications that seek to build feminist institutions. I am going to talk about the need to design gender-sensitive parliamentary workplaces for both elected representatives and staff. I may share my presentation. Well, we know that the ways in which parliaments are stratified by gender and produce power inequalities impact on both elected representatives and staff, but most academic research largely focuses on MPs, and practitioners' recommendations also tend to address the needs of MPs and the staff in a disconnected fashion. Yet, given that all groups that work in a legislature are affected in an interim way by the gendered operation of existing practices and processes, an integrated approach is needed to build a gender-sensitive workshop for all. I'll illustrate the policy application of this approach through the example of the Parliament of Catalonia. And before I do so, let me start with some background notes on the Catalan case, on this particular Parliament. This Parliament has had a non-legislative committee on gender equality since 1988, and starting a month ago, this committee has become a legislative committee. Also since 2006, it has had an intergroup on sexual and reproductive rights, very progressive in orientation. Also, it has passed very progressive laws in the fields of gender-based violence, gender equality, as well as LGTB rights, laws that span in scope and breadth the Spanish legislation. The most recent case being, for example, the reform of the gender-based violence law in 2020, where violence against women, for example, was included as one area for a specific action, as well as it was all the content of the law was adapted to the Istanbul Convention. The Parliament has had a gender balanced composition since 2010, with over 40% women. Currently, the share of women MPs is 44%. Electoral gender quotas, statutory ones, have been in place since 2007, but some left-wing parties already had party voluntary quotas since the 1980s. As you can see, also, the Parliament had already introduced substantial gender reforms in terms of the organization of the institution. For example, proxy voting for parental leave situations was introduced in 2006 for women MPs, and in 2015 for men MPs, and other situations were also included, such as illnesses or hospitalizations. At the same time, different workshops and public engagement activities are held regularly on gender equality issues, and that has been the case since about 2 decades ago, but this is the amount of activities have. And this gender action plan was the result of the Parliament commissioning to gender consultants, among which I participated, and we were commissioned to elaborate a gender audit, an exhaustive one that took into account both the situation of MPs as well as parliamentary staff, as well as the staff that the parliamentary party groups hire for the advising of the parliamentary party groups. And this gender audit was based on both EPU's, the Interparliamentary Union's Gender-Sensitive Parliaments Framework, as well as AGES, the European Institute for Gender Equality, which I see both frameworks as very complementary. And another facilitator was that the support for the Gender Action Plan was basically unanimous amongst all parliamentary party groups. We could say that the right-wing parties were not enthusiastic, but they did not oppose to the idea. But most crucially, the speaker was very committed to it. It was almost a personal project. So he poured significant resources to the success of the Gender Action Plan, including facilitating or providing the gender consultants with the support of his closest advisors as feminists in residence that would guide us on how to obtain the data, who to talk to, the preparation of interviews. The collaboration was amazing. But as said, and that was one of the points that gender consultants made, was it is great to have your support, but we need this to be an institutional project. Otherwise it might not last when you stop being the speaker. So we suggested that a gender equity working group, or in any case, a reference group was created, which took the name of Gender Equity Working Group, in which not only representatives of its parliamentary party group sat, but also representatives from the institution staff, representatives from the Human Resources Office, the Speaker's Office as well, along with the gender experts, so that we could be monitored, we could explain how the process was going on, and we could discuss the connection between the gender audit we were doing and the findings of the audit with the actions that we would suggest and we would draft for the gender action plan. In terms of sexual harassment, we know that it can affect, it can occur across different groups. The perpetrator can be, and is often an MP, but it can also be a parliamentary staffer. It can be any person that works in Parliament, and I'm using person and not just men because the protocol includes not just gender-based violence, but also LGBTI phobia. And in this case, besides having approved the protocol, the Parliament has created an equality office, and the equality official is the person receiving the complaint and accompanying the victim. And the Parliament is now in the process of establishing, to externalizing, so to say, the support services, because it secures confidentiality, as well as that the person, the victim, receives the sufficient accompanying measures in terms of psychological therapy, as well as any legal counsel, etc. That's paid by the Parliament, but it takes place outside the Parliament. Mandatory training is also mandated for both the MPs as well as all types of parliamentary staff on the prevention and detection of both gender-based violence and LGBTI phobia. And both MPs as well as parliamentary staff have to sign a zero tolerance declaration against discrimination and sexual harassment. Failure to do so at the moment does not have any consequence besides, we could say, naming and shaming, because this declaration is uploaded on the individual MP's website, the official MP's website in Parliament. But the Gender Equity Working Group is now working on the reform of the parliamentary procedure, the rules of procedure, and when this becomes mandatory, then other consequences can be imposed, such as, for example, not being able to be a reporter in a committee, or not being able to represent the Parliament in institutional visits, for example. That's to be decided in the next few months. And if you would like more information, the Parliament has a specific section on Parliament and gender, where you can download the Gender Action Plan in English. Unfortunately, the remainder of the website is only in Catalan, but you can use Google Translate and get an approximate idea of what the Parliament has been doing. And of course, I'll be happy to answer your questions, both relating to the presentation as well as to other types of action that the Parliament has undertaken in this past couple of years. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Cheryl Collier, and alongside my research partner, Dr. Tracey Raney, I am pleased to present a brief summary of the policies and codes of conduct that the Canadian federal government has enacted to address some aspects of gender-based violence in politics. Canada was an early adopter of these types of policies and codes, which aim to prevent and adjudicate incidents of some forms of gender-based violence, mainly harassment and sexual harassment, in the workspaces of staff and elected members of the House of Commons. As our presentation will argue, the Canadian case is a mixed bag of sorts that in large part still falls short in adequately addressing these problems. As this slide shows, Canada was one of the first legislatures in the world to enact anti-harassment, sexual harassment policies and codes of conduct. In fact, it was the first Westminster legislature to introduce a sexual harassment code to cover incidents between elected MPs in the world. Both the staff MP as employer policy and MP to MP code of conduct were enacted prior to widespread attention to these issues in the wake of the 2017 Me Too movement's resurgence. This includes the 2014 House of Commons Policy on Preventing and Addressing Harassment and the 2015 Code of Conduct for members of the House of Commons Sexual Harassment. Both of these came into effect under a Conservative government in the partial response to a scandal involving 2 elected Liberal MPs who were accused of sexual misconduct against 2 elected NDP MPs. In 2018, post-Me Too, the Liberal government that was in power at the time passed Bill C-65 to extend sexual harassment and harassment protections to all federally employed staff across the country. Bill C-65 eventually prompted amendments to the 2014 staff policy, which were included in the newer Members of the House of Commons Workplace Harassment and Violence Prevention Policy introduced in January of this year. But notably, these did not alter the MP to MP code. The MP to MP code went through a one-time mandated review in 2017-18, which resulted in small amendments that did not substantially improve the code's effectiveness or scope, particularly from a gender-based analysis perspective. While by and large we are critical of both of these sexual harassment policies codes, there were some good things inside of these processes, particularly inside of the post-Me Too 2021 newer staff policy. We summarize these on this slide. As noted, both policies codes paid early attention to harassment and sexual harassment, which are included in the continuum of gender-based violence that women in politics can face, although the focus of both policies remain limited in scope, with the staff policy's recent amendment faring a bit better by including incidents of sexual violence. Both also include much needed training to ensure that workers in the House of Commons, elected and non-elected, understand what constitutes harassment, sexual harassment, and how to avoid and report it. This training became mandatory for all, as well as routinized for staff and MPs as employers, with more recent amendments. The staff policy also mandates a yearly report, which is anonymized, of the use of the policy, along with attention to the need to permit survivors to be able to report outside of party-controlled reporting structures. The latter was a recent amendment post-Me Too, as was the requirement to regularly review the policy to ensure its effectiveness.
Thank you, Cheryl. Despite the fact that the Canadian House of Commons was an early adopter in dealing with these issues in terms of its MP to MP code of conduct, its response has some serious shortcomings, and I'm going to review a few of these here looking at staff policy and the MP code itself. Neither the policy nor the code include data collection provisions that informed their development or afterwards. So that means that we don't know the scope or the depth of the problem of gender-based violence in Canadian politics. And there was also no public inquiries into these issues. Neither the policy nor the code paid much attention to gender-based violence specifically or provided definitions of it, or to intersectionality. So in terms of how a person might experience violence based on their race, for example, is not referred to or mentioned in either document. The type of training that's provided will also not necessarily be effective. So there's a choice between online versus in-person training, and we know that in-person training is usually better. And the scenarios that are provided in the training are also not gender-based. The code and the policy also both include provisions that allow for vexatious or false claims to be punished. And this relies upon a rape myth that women are prone to falsely report being sexually assaulted. And this is going to likely result in a chilling impact on reporting of these issues in the Canadian House of Commons. Both the policy and the code also include limited independent adjudication and oversight. We can see this most clearly in their sanctioning processes. So while an independent investigator can recommend that disciplinary action be taken, the staff policy leaves the final determination about whether a perpetrator will receive any punishment in the hands of politicians. If that perpetrator or respondent is an employee, it's the member that decides. If that respondent or perpetrator is a member, it's the House's rather secretive Board of Internal Economy that makes the determination about whether a sanction will be imposed. In the MP Code, even if an independent investigator decides that disciplinary action should be taken against an MP, it's the respondent's whip that makes that determination itself. The MP Code also has some additional limitations. So it only deals with sexual harassment and not with other forms of violence. There's no reporting of the use of the code or of MPs who breach it. And this lacks accountability in this respect in particular. Several of these shortcomings derive also largely from the functioning of parliamentary privilege, which means that the House is largely self-regulating and has very limited external oversight, especially when dealing with the conduct of its members and how unethical behavior should be regulated. And we can see this both in the staff policy and the MP Code, which are overseen entirely by the House, and they approve these policies and they decide when to review them and when to change them. These are not fair or legitimate processes to potential survivors of harassment, especially when these processes are enacted largely behind closed doors. And in a time period when heightened media and public scrutiny is being paid to problems of sexual assault and sexual harassment, democratically elected chambers need to be seen to be addressing and taking these issues seriously, and so that they can be judged by members of the public and how they are responding to them. We have some lessons that we think can be taken away for other jurisdictions in terms of how the Canadian House of Commons has addressed these issues. Any new code should involve gender-based violence experts throughout, at the beginning when the policy is being discussed, all the way through incorporated into the processes themselves of adjudication and training. It should incorporate intersectional and systemic causes of gender-based violence in its policy development. It should avoid rape mythologizing or victim blaming in its policy language. It should create an independent oversight body to look over the investigation and the sanctioning processes. It should include public disclosure provisions. And we think that anti-violence advocates also should watch for when and who it is that's asserting parliamentary privilege in the development of the code itself, and to whose benefit is it that parliamentary privilege is being asserted. In our research, we found that oftentimes it's being used to protect white male perpetrators of violence and harassment. Thank you so much for listening. We know that this was very brief. We put up a few follow-up sources for you with some research that we've done in the Canadian case, and we have our contact information here. Thank you so much for listening.
Sonia and Sarah are with us. Sarah's on Zoom. Kerryn is here in person. Tania is with us on Zoom, and as is Cheryl. So we should have, with the exception of Sweden, we should be able to interrogate any and all of the presentations along with some general contributions. So I am being surrounded by technology, and I'm being informed that the online audience questions will come through on the chat. So excuse me if I'm looking at that. I will do my best to keep my eyes on both. But who would like to start the discussion going? Oh, thank you, Blair. That's going to run round. Yes, please.
Hi, can I ask with the UK, Canada, and Catalonia, do the codes and the processes make any distinction between staff of MPs and staff of ministers? Are they all incorporated in those regulations?
Okay, so that's to Canada, the UK, and Catalonia. Tania, would you like to go first?
I think Cheryl was first. Please go ahead, Cheryl. Yeah.
Thanks, Tanya. So if I heard the question correctly, because I had a little trouble listening to the exact wording of the question, my understanding was there a distinction between staff of ministers and staff of just regular MPs? For the Canadian case, there's no distinction at all.
Tania?
In the Catalan case, there used to be a distinction that after the new legislative term starting in 2021, this distinction has disappeared. And I would also like to mention that the code includes as well journalists that work in the parliament. I mean, journalists from independent media, right, that follow the parliamentary activity. It also includes witnesses, visits, members of government who are not MPs. So actually everyone who steps foot on the parliament will be subject to the protocol.
Do we still have? Oh, we do. Great.
Yeah, you do. Although I'm not I don't know the answer, because I think we might want to distinguish between those people who work for MPs in their MP roles and those who might be civil servants working for MPs as ministers but are employed. So I think what that does is it raises those questions about how MPs employ staff, and so whether they are the direct employers of staff or whether people are the employees of others. And I think that in the UK case, that's been very difficult. Some of the initial efforts were to do with people who worked in the House but may not have originally covered those who worked for MPs as advisors or in their own private offices. And that's because we just don't treat members of parliament as employees because they're elected officials. So I think that raises those very interesting questions. And I think, as Tania suggested, the UK case is to recognising it's about all those they come into contact with. But I think in terms of the actual ministerial distinction, I'd have to say I wouldn't want to speak to that because I'm not able to give you a correct answer on that one. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. And it raises the, again, the contextual specificity of the systems that we're working with and the need to be very attentive to what is included and what isn't. Thank you, Sarah. Next question, yes, please. Thanks, Marion.
Thanks, Helen. Quick question, I think basically for Sarah. She said that the complaint handling mechanisms were really outside her remit of developing a quick parliament framework. But for us, it's very important to know how the historic cases capacity of the complaint and grievance scheme in the UK is working. That they have the capacity to deal with historic cases because of the White report recommending it as a way of influencing the behaviour of MPs. White considered that staffers were less likely to put in complaints because of the fear of career suicide, but the former staffers might well put in complaints, and that would be very useful in influencing MPs. But is that operating as hoped, Sarah, in the UK?
Thank you, Marion, and hello. The line was a bit difficult, but I think what you were suggesting was to what extent are historic cases now included within the complaints procedure, and that has been that is the case. So there was initially resistance, and what was quite interesting was this idea that when a new complaint system came in, you could only treat cases up from the moment that it was introduced. And I think it's quite clear that there was recognition that not being able to deal with historic cases was hugely problematic. So my understanding is that some of those historic cases are being currently looked at.
We've been in a discussion here today about the role of the use of alcohol in the Australian Parliament. And I was just wondering if there are any measures around alcohol or protocols around alcohol in any of these other parliaments.
Oh, great question. Kerryn, can I start with you?
Yeah, so there's no kind of push on this yet. New Zealand Parliament actually still does have a bar. It's not very well used, I don't think. People just tend to drink in their offices or across the road at the backbencher pub. But I think it's definitely an issue. It came up in the Francis review, but it wasn't a focus, I guess, because the focus of the review was bullying within parliamentary offices, which isn't necessarily, alcohol might not be a massive factor there, but certainly in terms of the Commonwealth Women Parliamentarians Group research on violence against women in politics, alcohol was definitely a factor there. So it's a recognised issue. I don't think there's been kind of any push to put in measures against it yet.
Cheryl, can we come to you?
Yeah, so there's no mention at all of alcohol. When Bill C-65 came in, there was an extension of parliamentary workplaces to include socializing events. So you could expect that alcohol would be there, but there's no kind of consideration of limiting alcohol or being kind of wary of that. But the staff policy particularly, and the MP code, I think it doesn't specifically address, but probably would extend to incidents that occur in workplaces that would be seen as outside of your traditional office. So if it was over a dinner or whatever, where a place where alcohol would be served, but there's no addressing limits or kind of, I guess, warning about overuse of alcohol.
Right, and Tania, how about in Catalonia?
There is not, and maybe it has to do with the fact that it is a relatively small region, so MPs actually go back home after the sittings. And yeah, I mean, it's feasible to do so, right? In 2 hours, if you live far from Barcelona, you get to your place of residence. So the informal networking is more during the day, in meals, for lunch. So alcohol, if you have to go back to the session in the afternoon, doesn't work that well. So it never came out in our interviews in which the issue of harassments came out. So it was not included in the protocol then either.
Great. And Sarah?
I think what Tania just said was really interesting about the distinction between institutions that we can think of as total institutions, where people are present for very long hours in concentrated time periods, right? And those institutions where people either, as in the Swedish case, have very fixed times and people actually exit the estate at 6 p.m. or 5 p.m., right? And those where they have evening sittings. What I think is really interesting about the alcohol debates in the UK Parliament is how they're also fractured by the prism of staff interests and MP interests. And my perception, having spoken to staff, is that there's sometimes a concern that what will happen is that the staff bar will be closed and restricting sort of socializing, networking for staff as a response to the misbehavior of MPs. So I think the alcohol debate gets caught up with a way of minimizing responsibility for misbehavior. So you blame the alcohol and you don't blame the person in a hierarchy with you or who is bullying or harassing you. And so I think there's lots of interesting debates about the role of alcohol in parliaments as I guess the lubricant that is so central to quite a lot of those informal networking moments. But I think that concern that there's a slightly Puritan and I think use of alcohol to abnegate responsibility of changing the behaviour of those who abuse others, that I think is something gender sensitive Parliament scholars should be really thinking about. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
If I may add something that's also interesting, because maybe because the Catalan Parliament is a relatively new institution, it doesn't have a club. It has a cafeteria and it serves wine and beer, but it would be such a bad behavior, you know, to be drunk during the day, you know, like 1 p.m., 2 p.m. when people have lunch, and it closes around, I think it's between 6 or 7 p.m. So it doesn't allow for this other type of socializing in which alcohol would, you know, run quite happily. Yeah.
There's just while we have you on the screen, Tania, we've had a comment rather than a question that I'd be interested in others' thoughts on, but it came up in your presentation that if we understand you correctly, that your example and the regulations include journalists. Is that right?
It does.
I mean, that is something that is very different, I think, from other experiences. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how that happened and what impact it's had.
Okay, so the policy is very recent. It's pending final approval because there was in between elections, but the draft hasn't changed and the political will is to pass it as it said. So it includes all persons that inhabit parliament. So it's not just those that are elected representatives and the staff and the political advisors, but also any person who might actually work in parliament, and journalists do when they follow the parliamentary activity, as well as the people from the cafeteria, the cleaning services, the maintenance services. So all these external hires that the parliament needs for the very same maintenance of the institution, as well as witnesses that come to parliamentary committees, school visits. So everyone that steps foot in parliament, if a situation of harassment occurs while in parliament, this would be covered. And it would cover also situations in which the harassment occurs as a result of the parliamentary activity, which might take place outside parliament, for example, during a constituency visit by the MP or an institutional visit of a group of MPs to a business company, social group, whatever. So it is very expansive in what's called the territorial application of the protocol, right? So the subjective is a member of parliament. So the objective application is a situation of sexual harassment, more generally gender-based violence or LGBTQ phobia, but where it takes place, it's more open. Anytime that an MP, a parliamentary staff is involved, the protocol applies. Not in personal life. So if an MP harasses her neighbor, that wouldn't be included. But if he does so as an MP, because it's holding a session with constituencies, a meeting, whatever, then the protocol would also apply, even if the situation has happened outside the parliament.
Terrific. We have a specific question, Cheryl, about the Canadian case. To what extent has mandatory training in Canada addressed inappropriate parliamentary or staff behaviour? Do we have any significant evidence at this point about the impact that it's had?
So a colleague of mine is starting to look into some of the impacts of the training. It's hard to track because there's not a recording of whether or not you have in-person training or you get training that is online. And probably lots of us have had both of those experiences, and online training can be quite unsatisfactory, I suppose. The training video that they put together for Canadian staff and for MPs is particularly focused on more kind of uncivil behavior harassment, not so much on sexual harassment, not so much about dealing with power differentials, and not so much about getting people to think through what they would do in certain situations. So to try and I think, see themselves in those situations where we understand for training purposes, those are probably the most ineffective. You can kind of, fast forward through videos and that sort of thing. There have been some in-person training sessions that have been offered, but it's really, again, the reporting on this and the tracking of it. So the sharing of this with others, just even kind of figuring out how many people have taken the training and what type of training it is not very well recorded. So to try and track what is effective and what isn't, and how that is being, the uptake of that is actually being absorbed by people that are going through the training is really quite difficult at the moment, and it's something that we're going to try and do a little bit more work on, but it's even trying to figure out who's watched the video. The videos are available. I've watched the video, so you can't look at downloads or watches of the video to figure out if it's an MP that's done that, or a staffer that's done it, or it's somebody like myself that watched it. So it is really hard to kind of track this. I don't think they were that concerned about it. It is the parties have to make sure that when you're doing MP orientations, that everybody is checking a box and going through some kind of form of the training. It is also mandatory for staff, but it's up to supervisors to ensure that they're doing that training. And again, it's not really reported.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, question at the back, Larry. Make free with the microphone.
Thanks. So I've got a question in terms of how instances of sexual harassment are framed. And so in Australia, what's striking is that where things are framed as personal bad behaviour, politicians seem to be able to write that out. And there's other possible framings of this. So in the Four Corners episode that triggered some of these debates in Australia, there was the issue that a minister could be compromised in terms of national security. And I'm wondering, in terms of if we frame this as professional integrity rather than as kind of a personal he said, she said kind of situation, which is how the debate seems to be happening in Australia in terms of scandals. Professional integrity is a question of how things are seen from the outside, rather than actually making victims and survivors do all the hard work that we're currently doing. And I'm just wondering whether in other countries there's been this concern about kind of national security and professional integrity, rather than bad behaviour by blokes.
So if we frame it differently, might we have both a different result, but also might it be less horrific for people who experience it? Kerryn.
Well, I think the interesting thing in New Zealand, I think, is that it's changing over time, but there was this convention that private life is private, and so you can't say anything about an MP's private life, no matter what they're doing. There was a case, there was an MP who, a minister who resigned when it came out that he had an affair, but the media was framing it as, well, his mistress was here at this work event at the same time, so how do we know that any money, like any public money, was spent on her? We don't. And there was a investigation, and it turned out that there wasn't, but he had still resigned already. So I think that wasn't a case of sexual harassment, but I think there was, I remember it being a staffer, and there were cases of sexual harassment that weren't covered by the media, and the response of journalists was, we can't cover MP's personal lives. So that's I think the professional integrity, I think, is kind of a way that actually the stuff does come to light when you can link it, because then journalists can say, okay, I've linked it to the national interest, so I've done my part. I think that's, yeah.
Yeah, that's a very interesting response. Would you like to come in on this?
Yeah, I think, I think that's why, I like the point that framing it is potentially important in how we might understand these things. And we've certainly had a lot of talk today about the difference between scandal-based reviews And what I would suggest is a more holistic review of the Parliament from a gender equality perspective. For a gender equality perspective review to take place, however, you actually need to have some champion in the Parliament to initiate that and to work with. And I just want to pay my respects to the number of people who presented here, including the ones who are in Sweden, who are those critical actors who drive these reforms. Sarah, Tania, Josefina, and Cecilia. They've all done remarkable work working with parliaments as a whole to support their identification of where the gaps are and what the solutions are for that. So I think it's really important to kind of pay tribute to those people's work, but I really think that the reframing needs to be more holistic. I don't think just national security would be the issue. I'd like to see a much more comprehensive review of gender equality.
Okay. Cheryl, can we come to you?
Sure. So yeah, I tend to agree with the last point. I think, you know, in Canada anyways, we've had a lot of the scandal-based reactionary policy, and there's been a little bit of kind of revisiting of that, but there's been a lot of hiding behind it and not doing, you know, a lot of the right things, because you can get away with not doing the right things because it seems like you've done something and you can check a box and that's fine. So I think the framing, we have to be careful. If it's framed too narrowly, I think it allows for a little bit of an easy exit in not really dealing with kind of core structural, cultural problems. So when we're thinking about a gender-sensitive parliament, we're thinking about making the parliament truly responsive to equity in all its forms. And that is an ongoing, as Sarah was saying before, that's not a one-off, that's a constant project, and it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a lot of people and a lot of effort. And I think that is a much more worthwhile project. I wish we had been invited in Canada to do some of that work, but our parliament's not there right now. I think they think they're doing just fine. We have a feminist prime minister, don't you know, and he, you know, kind of owns that agenda. But it's really esoteric. There's not a lot of real deep kind of looking at processes, looking at culture, looking at experiences. And, you know, as in the Swedish example, of how are people experiencing their time in Parliament? Not a lot of discussion of that going on here in Canada. And I think the framing of this is a really big piece that that needs to ask those tougher questions and do that harder work.
Right. Tania, over to you.
In the Catalan case, it was not a scandal-driven reform, and the protocol is just an action included in the gender action plan. So as Sonia was saying, it was a more general approach, but there was a scandal, so to say, which was in 2017, the board of the chamber, where the presiding body of the chamber, where the speaker and the vice president sit, it's made up of 7 members, and only 1 woman was included among those 7. And for a country that had been applying successfully gender quotas for, you know, electoral lists, and it was pushing for that at all domains of society, and businesses and universities are obliged to have gender action plans and sexual harassment codes of conduct. It was, now it's the time that the parliament needs to lead, needs to be a role model institution in how to not just define those instruments, but also apply them. So there was this, this context that facilitated that the parliament assumed this, this reform, and was very open. The gender audit was published on the website, so with all the data, you know, there was no data taken out, even if it was, you know, some indicators were not good for the parliament, but it was really a commitment to be transparent, to have civil society organizations as well be explained what the parliament was doing. And it was this holistic approach as well to take into account the functions of parliament, including the legislative function, the symbolic function. Of course, now the plan has to be implemented. Several actions have already been implemented, but the fact that it is a multi-annual gender action plan that does not depend on the legislative term itself is very powerful. And as said, having this gender equity working group in which not just MPs, but also parliamentary staff are there, makes it less dependent on the political will of the speaker, right? Because there is a commitment that the institution has adopted and it survives regardless of who presides the parliament. And at least this is so for 4 years, and several actions are expected to be implemented very soon as well.
Thank you. And Sarah?
Yeah, I think we have to be careful about trying to come up with individual solutions to really structural problems. And I think I realize with bullying and harassment, it often is the actions of individuals, but it's about the context within which those individuals feel freely able to behave in certain kinds of way. And this week we've found out that as MPs come back to Parliament in greater numbers, MPs staff, or the staff of the House rather, are required to wear masks and MPs are not. And I think that just illustrates within a single organisation a hierarchy and a segmentation that absolutely reinforces a culture within which exploitation can fester and be realised on an everyday basis. We're creating two categories of people, and some are in hierarchical positions over them. And for me, that just adds to many other examples within these kind of institutions where those with much less power are put in positions where they can be exploited. And I think it's really important that we broaden out this concern to the everyday and very smaller incidences where abusive relationships can happen. And I think we have to, and I guess this goes back to Sonia's point, is that we can't just deal with the more extreme end, if you like, of the practices, because actually they begin in the everyday. They begin in the fact, well, this is my view anyway, that in certain shared spaces there are tables just left for MPs. This to me inculcates a culture of hierarchy, which is where those notions of being able to behave in certain kinds of ways by some people and be free to do so. And then I suppose just very quickly and precisely back to the questioner, what concerns me a little bit about relying on notions of professionalism and professional standards is that do many of us have much confidence in things like standards in public life? I mean, at the moment, I would argue in the UK, a large number of ministers, members of parliament have been found to have been foul of those standards. So those standards don't work in their own terms, it seems to me. So to use those to protect those who will be victims and survivors of harassment and bullying doesn't seem to work for me. But I think so that's a kind of sort of critique of reframing in that way. But I think it's a bigger one. I think it's about institutional reform in the round. Thanks.
Thank you. Sonia?
I just want to follow up Sarah's point about the hierarchy of people who work in these institutions. In Australia, parliamentary staff are covered by a policy of sexual harassment. And I was reminded earlier this week by a former colleague that didn't prevent harassment and bullying from MPs of parliamentary staff. And I was reflecting on that, and that while parliamentary staff in Australia don't depend in terms of their livelihood on those members of parliament, they do depend on the culture of the department to do something about it. So that comes from the top. Where there are parliamentary clerks who are happy to champion their independence and the independence of that department from their political masters, which they do have, but they can choose not to, then I think, you know, we're doing relatively well. But I think under a government in particular, and I was talking to someone about this earlier, under a government that is encroaching more and more on the public service and determining what advice they want to take and what advice they don't want to take,
the effect has been of increased risk aversion, and the risk aversion comes with a conservatism. And so you don't push the envelope. So I think we also need to think about, right, okay, well, there may be a code, there may be a policy for parliamentary staff, but where is the culture and what determines that culture in terms of applying and sanctioning? And parliamentary staff can't really sanction the MPs who might be responsible for that, but they certainly can. They can stand up for themselves and say, we're not taking that kind of behaviour. You MPs do not determine what happens to this body of individuals, this group of individuals. You don't determine whether they go on and they work on this committee because you want them or you don't want them.
Okay, I've been getting lots of messages telling me that you all had a very long day and that we need to reserve something in the tank for tomorrow. So I would like to thank all of our presenters and speakers, both those here in the room, Kerryn and Sonia, and those online, Sarah, Josefina, Cecilia, Tania, Cheryl, and Tracey. Thank you all so much for giving us so much to think about, and I think it'll take a lot of digesting. I have to say, Tania, you've come up with something I'm going to take with me and use everywhere, which is the idea of feminists in residence. I think that is just the most beautiful thing that I will certainly be deploying myself, but much more to think about. So thank you all for staying up late, getting up early, whatever it is you've been doing. We really, really do appreciate it. And can we please thank the panel in the usual way.